How soon after amputation will you get a prosthesis? That's a complicated question because getting your first prosthetic leg is less of a one-time event and more of a timeline. That timeline begins before amputation, unless your leg was lost unexpectedly, such as in an accident. Before an elective amputation, it's wise to meet multiple prosthetists and choose your favorite. This is even more important than you may realize, for reasons I'll explain in an upcoming video. After a pre-op appointment, your prosthetist will go over the care plan and answer your questions. The next time I saw my prosthetist was in the hospital a couple days after amputation. He had a tube-like device to put over my leg to protect it and keep the knee straight so the muscles wouldn't shorten and cause something called a contracture. He did a little measuring and cutting to make room for my kneecap, then strapped it all on. And since tubes tend to slide down footless legs, I lost my leg again. Oops. He also gave me a belt to keep it on when I was standing. There are many different types of post-surgical dressings. They address two big concerns, namely protecting your limb and preventing contractures. Precisely what you end up with depends a lot on your surgeon's preference. Some amputees are put in casts, others, like me, go home in rigid removable dressings, which come in multiple varieties. 3.5 weeks after amputation, my prosthetist checked on my leg and gave me a shrinker, which is basically a compression sock for residual limbs. After surgery, my amputated leg was very swollen. That's not ideal for fitting a prosthetic socket. So I was told to wear the shrinker for at least 2 weeks prior to starting the process of making a prosthetic leg. It makes sense. If you cast a mold of something while it's swollen, then the swelling goes down, the mold is going to be too big. At first, the shrinker was painful to put on. I mean, it was compressing freshly severed muscles, nerves, and bones. But my leg soon adapted. After a few weeks, my leg was no longer hypersensitive when I put on the shrinker, though I suspect the amount of time it takes varies person to person. After those couple weeks in the shrinker, I started the process of to get a leg. You see, before you start the physical process, you've got to address the paperwork. And just like with making the leg itself, paperwork is more of a process than a one-and-done event. Amputees always want to know when they can get a leg. The short answer is when the surgeon says so, and insurance plays along. In my case, I was told that the stitches needed to be out, the leg needed to be recovering well, and I needed to have been in the shrinker for a minimum of 2 weeks. My stitches were taken out in 2 sets. I have a video that goes into detail, but the short explanation is that the first set of stitches was taken out 2 weeks post-op. The next was taken out about a week later, though I wouldn't get too hung up on the number of days. If your leg was amputated due to something like diabetic wounds that wouldn't heal, then it might take longer for your incision to heal and for stitches to be removed. As nice as it would be to have a standard timeline so you know exactly when to expect various milestones, when you stop and think about it, isn't it better that the timeline is customized to your unique situation? I always like it when my doctors treat me like an individual. Anyhow, after a couple weeks in the shrinker, I went back to my surgeon. He evaluated my leg and gave the green light to get a prosthesis. Aside from the physical exam, his job included generating clinic notes and paperwork that would make the insurance happy, assuming such a feat is even possible. And since I'm not the one who did the back-end paperwork, I can't give you all the details. But you know who can? Your prosthetist. Some surgeons don't do many amputations, so they may not have a feel for exactly what insurance is after, because insurance can be pretty picky. Prosthetics clinics, by contrast, deal with this all the time. They have master-level skills when it comes to prosthetic paperwork. I always thought the paperwork was basically the doctor saying, "This patient is an amputee and needs a lower leg prosthesis." But my insurance paperwork has had to be hyper-specific. Not just saying I needed a prosthetic leg, but detailing what type of foot was medically necessary, the type of ankle, the socket, the liners, so on and so forth. And my doctor needed to provide justification for each element. It felt like trying to prove my case before a judge. And just like a court case, it helps to have a skilled lawyer on your side who knows the ropes. So if you or your surgeon have questions, a quick call to your prosthetist can be very helpful. And even though you're going through a lot of hard things as a new amputee, Now may be an opportune time for a moment of gratitude for the simple blessing of not being the person who has to do the bulk of the insurance paperwork. It's the simple things in life that make me happy. Dodging paperwork is one of them. Getting insurance prerequisites out of the way can take a few weeks, depending on your doctor's availability and how quickly he gets his side of the paperwork done. I suspect my prosthetics clinic also did a mountain of paperwork behind the scenes. By the time every I had been dotted and every T had been crossed, it was 6 weeks post-amputation, and it was finally time to cast my leg. Before casting, you need a liner. This liner is important because it's integral to holding your prosthetic leg onto your actual leg. The cast needs to be taken with the liner on because, except in special circumstances that most amputees don't need to worry about, you're never going to wear that socket without the liner. As such, the mold needs to include that extra bulk. There are different types of liners. Depending on the provider and the patient's situation, you may be measured in advance for a liner, or your prosthetist may use a liner that they have on hand, or should I say, on stump. If you're a unique size or need a customized liner for other reasons, you should plan on an extra trip to the prosthetist, plus extra time spent waiting for the manufacturer to send your liners to the clinic. If you're a common size, your clinic may just have you try on a few liners that they have readily available, then cast over the one that's best for you, all in the same appointment. What type of liner you're given depends on your suspension system, which makes me feel like a race car, but suspension is a fancy way of saying how the socket attaches to the leg. I'm working on a video that gives an overview of common types of suspension. What you need to keep in mind for your first leg is that your prosthetist knows the ins and outs of the options better than you do, especially in the beginning when everything is new to you. Your provider may have something in mind based on your unique situation. When my prosthetist strongly urged a pin-lock suspension system for my first socket, I trusted his judgment. As an amputee, you'll quickly learn that prosthetic limbs are all about trade-offs. The perfect leg is a healthy human leg, but since yours is missing, you'll have to choose between less perfect options, all of which have pros and cons. Just because one prosthetist favors suction sockets and another favors pin lock doesn't mean one is right and the other wrong. It just means that they're prioritizing different benefits or trying to minimize different drawbacks. When it comes to prosthetic limbs, you simply can't have it all. My prosthetist says that if you ask 6 prosthetists, you'll get 7 opinions. I feel like that should be a meme. Also keep in mind, even with the exact same amputee, what works for them at one point might not be the best solution for them at a different point when their circumstances have changed. We evolve and change with time. You know how kids grow up and constantly need new shoes in bigger sizes, but over time their growth rate slows down? A baby will change clothing sizes multiple times a year, whereas a 10-year-old might go a couple years in the same shirts. Your amputated leg will do something similar, changing size rapidly during the first year, but slowing the rate of change over time. Except, unlike kids, residual limbs tend to shrink. Barring weight fluctuations or other medical issues, I expect that the circumference of my leg will always be decreasing. You see, my calf muscles used to control my foot, but now that there's no foot, those muscles are out of a job and have atrophied. The more leg atrophies and the more the post-surgical swelling goes down, the less volume there is. For better or worse, this means your first socket might not fit as long as subsequent sockets before it gets too loose and needs to be replaced. Personally, I chose to think of this as an advantage because it meant if I didn't love the socket my prosthetist suggested, I could try a different type a few months later when I needed to be recast for a smaller socket. Experimenting felt less risky because my new socket was a short-term relationship, not a long-term one. Likewise, I followed my prosthetist's advice about which foot to attach to the socket. He picked one that would be fairly stable when I was learning to walk, whereas now I'm looking at feet that are springier. There's a time and a place for everything. My goal right after amputation wasn't to run a marathon. It was simply to get up and get walking. Like I said, there will be other opportunities to try different types of prosthetic devices. Learning to walk felt like the appropriate time to use tried and true options. It's worth noting that each prosthetist is likely to have his own way of doing things. There isn't one right way to take a mold. The same goes for the rest of the prosthetic process. As long as the end result is good, then I wouldn't get too hung up on whether your provider uses a different approach from someone else you heard about or saw in a YouTube video. The best method is the method that works best for you and your provider. Aside from that, each patient is so unique, including me, so please don't take this video as medical advice or a rigid timeline. I'm just sharing my experience and what I've heard from my providers and other amputees. Now that you've got a mold made, you're probably impatient to try on your new leg, but your prosthetist is going to need a little time. That leg isn't going to make itself, plus some parts may need to be ordered in. With all those factors, I don't know what the average wait time is for most amputees between the mold and the first test socket, but for me, it's usually been about a week. The next time you see your prosthetist isn't the time you get your final leg. Unlike shoes, which have memory foam and can be loosened or tightened with laces, a carbon fiber socket doesn't generally have any give or padding other than the liner. That means you want to make sure everything is comfortable and functional before it's cast in stone, or more accurately, in carbon fiber or fiberglass. There are other less common materials too. Even though the socket was made from a mold of your leg and should ideally be a perfect fit, that was a static mold taken while you were holding still. Once you start moving, it becomes a dynamic situation. So there might be sore points, plus your leg is ever changing, so the size and shape may be different a couple weeks after the mold was made. Hence the need for a test socket. The purpose of the test socket is to adjust the shape until it's comfortable and functional. The way it works is you try on the socket, walk around, point out any problem areas, then you take off your socket so the prosthetist can make adjustments based on your feedback. Plan on repeating this process many times. Since test sockets are made out of plastic, they can be heated up and adjusted. Things like the angle of the foot can also be tweaked. It's impressive how many different ways a single prosthetic leg can be adjusted. It's always taken me a few appointments to get things feeling right, so don't be discouraged if things take longer than you'd hoped. Remember, this is a process. While I have heard of methods like a direct cast socket, where you could theoretically do everything in a day, for me, it's always taken a few weeks. Again, I don't know the average for most amputees, but for myself, having done this a few times now, I usually plan on the process taking a month. A little shorter if I'm lucky, a little longer if my leg is being extra finicky. And while that feels like a long wait when you're impatient to walk again, keep in mind, this delay gives your leg more time to heal and be less tender. Plus, at each of those appointments, you'll be learning how to use the leg and take care of it. So you're accomplishing something important, even if you don't go home with a leg. When I took my first steps on a prosthetic leg, my residual limb was very sensitive. I think I'd unconsciously pictured a joyful moment when I'd be triumphantly back on 2 feet. Instead, my leg was very sore. It probably had something to do with having guillotined it a few weeks prior. I think this topic deserves its own video, so subscribe and click the bell if you don't want to miss hearing about expectations versus reality when it comes to taking your first steps as an amputee. After a few rounds of adjusting the test socket, my prosthetist and I agreed that the fit was working well enough and it was time to commit to the real deal. Previously, my prosthetist had told me that I was welcome to buy some fabric for the outside of the socket if I wanted something really unique. He also has glitter. I like glitter. Leaving my test socket and chosen fabric in his capable hands, I went home and waited 1 more week. At my next appointment, my prosthetist presented me with my first leg. Before I could run off with it, he checked things like the height, angle of the foot, and a host of other subtleties. For most amputees, that's the end of the story. You're given supplies such as a spare liner, some socks, and sent on your merry way. You take your new leg home and gradually build up endurance and confidence. But this is my story, so of course there's a plot twist. No sooner had I laid eyes on my first prosthetic leg than I was informed that insurance didn't want me to have it. So billing and insurance think I'm too
infirm and feeble to have a leg. So we're going to do a test to prove that I am not infirm. You want to give me a test? Bring it. We duel at dawn. First one up the hill wins.
If you want to hear that crazy story, here it is. I also have a playlist you might find helpful. So take your pick. Keep taking things one step at a time. Hang in there, and I'll see you in the next video.